And take two and action.
All right, welcome back, everybody, for another SSP podcast. I'm Joe.
Alex.
How's it going? Before we get rolling today, for all of you thousands of listeners out there, just wanted to make sure everybody knows that next week we are starting up our September Speed School. All right, Speed School this month is going to be on Wednesdays or Thursday nights. So we're looking for people to commit to one night and come in on that night for that entire 4-week block. It's been going really good, right?
Yeah.
Wouldn't you say? Love the progress that our guys make. Basically, what that speed school is just an hour of dedicated speed work. So some of the drills that we do are going to be working on acceleration. Some of the drills that we do are going to be working on more of your top speed mechanics and how that looks for the athletes. We do mix in a little bit of change of direction and kind of lateral movement, but for the most part, it is an hour-long deep dive into linear speed. In the 4 weeks that we've been, or the 4-week blocks that we've been using it, we've really, like I said, seen some really great results with our athletes, and we're excited to kind of expand it out into 2 nights for this upcoming month.
Yeah. It'll be nice. It'll be good to have that, ability to kind of mix and match around, especially there's like the volleyball games and all that stuff that people have to work around. So
Yeah,
it'll be nice to have the dual offering for that.
we've had our numbers kind of steadily growing with that, and so that's what kind of led us, that and the scheduling issues have kind of led us to opening it up on another night. So if you're interested, feel free to reach out to Alex or myself, and we can make sure that we get you more information or get you signed up. Today's topic, what we want to dive into, this might get a little ranty, so just heads up, right? But today we want to talk about some common misconceptions with regards to strength conditioning and the overhead athlete, or in our case, maybe a little more specifically, the baseball and softball world. I know Alex and I are inundated daily by questions from athletes, things we see on Twitter and Instagram that maybe don't mesh perfectly with our philosophies and what we've seen being in here on the floor every day with athletes, right? So, there's just so much information at our fingertips, fingertips of parents, fingertips of athletes, that all that information isn't like good quality information,
Yeah, it's
right?
easy to get sucked into a rabbit hole, whether it's good or bad or kind of somewhere in the middle. You usually get a mixture of both. There'll be things that you'll find online, whatever social media platforms, even that are some of it's really, really good information, and then some of it is really kind of clickbaity,
Yep.
fatty, and it's more for looks good on the camera and for views than anything else.
Then like solid strength and conditioning
Yeah, or the
information.
third category is it's just completely for a different population.
Yeah.
They're trying to train for, because at the end of the day, we're not training guys to be the best at back squatting or the best at deadlifting or the best at bench pressing or whatever exercise we choose here. We're training them to be the best all around athlete that can translate over to the field,
Right.
or court, or whatever sport
Whatever
they're
sport
deciding
they're
to
in.
play. So yeah.
Yeah, that's kind of what we always say is, there's certain things that we need to make sure, like certain boxes that we need to make sure are checked before the athletes, before we feel like they're like ready to step in between the lines, right? And, you know, I guess maybe like a mission statement that we have, or something that I always ask myself when I'm putting programming together, and I know we have this conversation a lot too when we're putting our heads together for programming, is how is this going to translate to their on-field performance, or is this going to be beneficial once they step in between the lines? And those are just some of the questions or a question that we ask that maybe your famous social media influencer who's putting out content to be looking for engagement or whatever their purpose is, they might not be asking that same question. So there's always kind of some lost in translation pieces with that information when it's coming from somebody you don't know their background. Uh, so I know a frustrating part for us is some of the quote unquote influencers who are out there who might have millions and millions of followers and that our athletes see every day on, like I said, Twitter, Instagram, TikTok. They might not actually be in the trenches like coaching, right? So it's easy to put something kind of sexy on one of the social media platforms, but a lot of the time the information is coming from somebody who's not actually working every day with the population that we are, you know.
Yeah,
So I think we feel like, you know, we have a leg up as far as understanding what the athletes need, just because we're with the athletes every
yeah,
day, you know.
yeah, and it's easy for, a lot of times it's like these influencers, they're going for more obviously views and engagement and stuff, but a lot of what they post is what they do to train to, a lot of times it's for bodybuilding, for a physique competition, sometimes just to train to look the best so then they can monetize their
Right.
stuff. And a lot of what they put out there is stuff that they do or that they've learned from other people for themselves to do. And they do that. And it's not necessarily always the best for a lot of what we do in here. And granted, disclaimer, there's a lot of things that they will do, from the squatting, hinging, pressing, or pulling patterns that we do in a way, but how it's implemented from a set and rep scheme, from a intensity scheme is very, very different. And
Hmm.
it's all meticulously chosen to be that way rather than just, oh, let's do, 10 sets of 10, bench press. And then afterwards, we're going to do 8 sets of 8 incline bench, and then we're gonna do like
Right.
just absolutely murder a upper body session.
I think it's really easy to get caught up in even some of the guys who are at the highest level. When we have youth athletes or high school athletes looking to them for some guidance, I think this last offseason, a big one was Jackson Holiday was in the news for putting on 20 pounds and, you know, coming back to spring training looking completely different. And then people were talking about the regiment that he kind of undertook this offseason. I know I've seen stuff on Bryce Harper. It doesn't take too much, you know, you don't have to look too hard to see a bunch of the kind of programs that some of the top guys in the game of baseball are running. You know, you can just do a quick Google search. I'm sure you get a ton of info. But the thing is, that can't just be overlaid onto a youth athlete or overlaid precisely onto a high school athlete, because we don't really know the steps that a Bryce Harper or steps that a Jackson Holiday has taken to get to that point where they're ready to kind of undergo that type of a program,
Yeah, that
right?
program isn't a starting point, right?
Right.
It's pretty close, not to a finish line, but it's like a lot of that is like, hey, Bryce Harper's trying to maintain more than anything else, so we're trying to keep him healthy and maintain power, speed, and strength numbers.
Hmm.
Jackson Holiday, it's like, okay, we need to put on 20 pounds this offseason. That's a little bit different than if we have a 15-year-old kid trying to put on 20 pounds.
Yeah. And it really comes down to, we talk about training age a lot with our athletes. So we could have two 15-year-olds who walk into the gym or two 16-year-olds who walk into the gym, same height, same weight. Maybe one of them has never been into a gym before, right? And maybe the other one's been training under the guidance of professionals for 3 or 4 years, right? Those athletes are going to be at drastically different spots in their development, right?
Yeah.
In their, like we said, we call it the training age. So to put both of those athletes into the exact same protocol would be a misstep, in my opinion, right? So that's kind of what we see when teams or individuals look at some of those high level guys and try to implement their programming on their own, right? Another really a, a really common thing that we hear is, you know, a high school kid got a program from his buddy who's now in the SEC or at some high level college program, right? And so the buddy's like, yeah, hey, here's what we do at insert school here, Texas, or here's what we do at even like a Creighton or a Nebraska or some school like that. And the younger athlete tries to just utilize that exact same program. Well, it might not turn out to have the best effect or stimulus in a positive way for that athlete who's trying to just grab that program and run with it, because they don't understand the steps that went into it. I know when I was in collegiate weight rooms, and I'm pretty sure I can speak for you, correct me if I'm wrong, but oftentimes the underclassmen, so the incoming freshmen, even sophomores who might not have the highest training age, are put on a slightly different program than the guys who've been in that program for 3 or 4 years,
Yep.
right? The strength coach in that situation is trying to get everybody onto a similar level, but it doesn't just happen automatically because you walk into collegiate weight room,
Yeah.
right? Or a D1 weight room, or whatever the scenario might be. There should be kind of an on-ramping or an onboarding of some of those less experienced athletes to try to get them into that kind of higher training echelon, or whatever you want to
Yeah.
call it. And it's something that gets overlooked oftentimes, but kind of making sure that the foundational movement capacity is in place is really important when trying to kind of reach your full genetic potential or your full athletic potential.
Yeah. And that's where, I mean, a lot of the benefit of having a professional within the industry, training you, whether that's in the collegiate setting or in the high school setting or whatever setting it might be, private sector like what we're in, that's where it's really, really beneficial to have someone like that, because they're able to parse you out into certain groups that allow you to, you don't want to, we talked about this in the previous podcast, I believe. You don't want to just throw in or a podcast in the past. We don't want to just throw a 15-year-old in a triphasic training cycle,
Hmm.
right? Um,
Like,
but
will you derive some benefit?
probably,
Probably,
yeah,
right? But you
probably,
might also stunt your ability for kind of that long-term athletic development
yeah.
that we're kind of chasing with our younger
Yeah,
guys.
and for example, when I got to Creighton, I transferred in. I was going in as a junior, and I had a great strength coach when I was at my first school for 2 years, and he did a great job teaching fundamentals and progressing and all of that. When I got to Creighton, all of the transfers and all the freshmen were put into the same group, and then they had to do testing. They
Yep.
had X
Certain
amount. Yeah,
benchmarks.
they had certain benchmarks they had to get to. They had certain, not just from a weight perspective, but from a form
Yeah,
perspective,
technical.
and they had certain benchmarks they had to get to before they got graduated to a different program.
Hmm.
And one of the guys that I follow quite a bit, and I believe you follow quite a bit, Zach Bacon down at TCU, um, he has three different programs that he runs with guys. He has beginner, intermediate, and advanced. And each guy gets parsed into each program, and once they reach certain benchmarks, they're able to graduate to the next program, and so on and so forth.
Hmm.
And that's the way to do it. And just circling a little bit back to that, finding Bryce Harper or Alex Bregman's training programs, or just grabbing a program from a buddy that might be at whatever college. There isn't, I kind of lost my train of thought, but there isn't like, what is my train of thought? I hate
Uh,
when this happens. This happens quite a bit for me. This will be cut out, but
there's just not, it's, you're just not going to have something that just works for everybody.
yes,
The athletes need to have something that kind of meets them where they're at, and then gives them kind of a roadmap or a pathway to progress. I was going to mention that about the benchmarks. Most of the time, it could be like, you need to grab the 100-pound dumbbell and need to be able to goblet squat it 20 times before we let you get under a
yep,
barbell, for an example, right? And or you need to be able to RDL X amount of weight before we put you on a bar to actually start pulling from the ground, or
yep,
things like that. That the athlete understands what they're looking for. They have goals, and so every time they're trying to reach that goal to get out of that training group that they're in to get up into the next training group,
yep,
right?
yep. And you know what the point that I was making was, um, oh my gosh, I completely forgot it again. This is getting crazy.
Okay.
Apparently, it's not important enough if I can't remember it. Okay, Joe, you're up.
Okay, so we kind of ranted for a second about just making sure we're meeting athletes where they're at, and doing right by them as far as long-term athletic development and stuff. Uh, but I also think in the baseball community, I'll lump softball in there too. We really like to get caught up in, this is a kind of green light exercise for this athlete because they're a baseball softball player, and this is maybe like a red light, like we don't do that exercise because they are a baseball softball player. And I know, like in here, for example, there are certain exercises that we do and there's certain exercises that we don't do, but a lot of that is based on kind of how our training is set up, right? I like to say that certain lifts are kind of like medicine. You can execute a lift, or you can take some or the correct amount of medicine and have a good response to it, a good stimulus in our case, or you can way overdo that exercise, or you can overdose on a medicine and you're going to have a negative response to
Yep,
that, right? So it's all about like prescription and dosage in our case of the exercise that we're giving. But again, like in the medical world, when we're talking about drugs and medicines, the same thing can happen, right? If
Yeah.
you overdose on a medicine, it's going to have negative effects. If you have the right amount, it's going to help you get better or cure your sickness or whatever it might be. So that's kind of a long-winded of saying way of saying that we live in a lot of gray area,
Yep.
right? So like all of the exercises that we choose to put in, we put them in for a reason, right? I guess kind of a common one that we hear a lot about are some pressing variations, right? So this one, I think, like I said, people are going to like to hear is like, do you? One of the first questions I get if I'm talking to somebody, do you barbell bench guys? Do you dumbbell bench guys? Or do you not bench at all when we're talking about baseball players? And the answer a lot of the times is it
Yeah.
depends, right?
Yeah.
We from from our setup in here, we know that we can't have our squat racks that we use for multiple different things, or it makes our lives harder if they are being used just for bench,
Yeah.
right? They become a little less multidimensional, and all of a sudden we have less squat racks to work with. So we don't do a lot of barbell benching in here for that reason. I think it's safe to say that there are some athletes in here who might benefit from barbell benching, and then there's some athletes who we don't feel are ready either from a like a training side, they're not ready for that sort of stimulus, or from a health standpoint where maybe there was something in their eval that popped up and it was like,
Yeah.
maybe a barbell bench isn't the right exercise selection for this athlete. You know what I'm
Oh
saying?
yeah, for
Right?
sure. And just to that point, like there is so much gray area, and trying to find, a lot of what we do isn't, there's multiple different factors that we got to factor in, right? There's what we're able to do in the space that we have.
Hmm.
There's the age group that we're working with. There's the training age that we're working with, and then there's just the overall flow and busyness of the gym.
Hmm.
And we have to work around all those factors to try to create a well-oiled machine that doesn't have any issues running. And the simple one with the barbell bench is, yeah, people can benefit from it, and
Hmm.
probably a lot of our athletes would, just from a little bit of a change in stimulus.
Hmm.
But it does create a lot of issues when it comes to if we're trying to squat or split squat or
Yeah, we use the
anything.
racks for a
Yeah,
lot of
we
lower
usually
body stuff.
do it for a lot of the lower body stuff, like racks usually are used for, and it creates a lot of issues for that. And then I know for me, a lot of our athletes aren't they don't they don't bench press the 90-pound dumbbells for our heaviest dumbbells for 5 reps or 10
Hmm.
reps or something like that. So, excuse me. So why would we try to change too much of a stimulus by actually just changing the bar or the dumbbell when we could just change how they're doing it to try to elicit a different response, whether that's
Hmm.
from a set rep scheme of intensity scheme, overall volume, or from just, if it's decline, flat, low incline, medium incline, higher incline,
Hmm.
there's a bunch of different ways that we can kind of manipulate that curve
Right.
to try to elicit a good response. And you know, to transition, not necessarily transition a little bit, but stay on that same thing, but go to a different, kind of fatty, like common thing that is done in weight rooms is a lot of Olympic variations.
Hmm.
And we do very minimal kind of different type Olympic
Hmm.
variations, but it's usually with a landmine, whether that's with a Viking handle or just a landmine in general. But we get a lot of really good benefits, and we feel like we can get more out of jumping, sprinting, throwing med balls, different technical work that we
Hmm.
implement within it, whether that's, you know, A switches or pogos or hurdle jumps or multi-directional jumps, or there's a million different ways to do it.
Right.
Just to kind of go back to the original point, we live in so much gray area.
Hmm.
And there's a phrase I learned a while back. It was, there's a million ways to skin a cat. And I
Yeah.
remember when I learned it, I'm like, that's the wildest phrase I would ever use to compare to something. But like, it's something that has stuck with me. But there's a million ways to skin a cat. Like, there's a million different ways that we can do stuff in here. We could just one day, if we wanted to start teaching Olympic variations, we could. But there's so much technicality with it for us to actually get the power and speed response and force production, like
Hmm.
stimulus out of it. It takes, I mean, months to create, quality technique for that.
And kind of going back to that, there's a million ways to skin a cat. If you break down, so we everyone wants to get caught up in, is X lift good or bad? Is X lift good or bad? Like yes or no, good or bad? And it's really when you break it down and you think about it, it comes down to what is the stimulus we are trying to elicit out of the athlete, right? So let's use your variation or your example of the we'll just say the power clean, right? Because that's the one we hear a lot. So, what are you trying to get out of the power clean, right? You're trying to work vertical forces, you're trying to
Triple
work,
extension.
yeah, triple extension, which I guess you could probably argue a little bit on, right? Or at least my perspective is that a lot of times you don't see true triple extension
Exactly.
with it. A lot of coaches that do employ the Olympic lifts or especially the clean think there's really good like deceleration properties of the catch if they're actually doing a full catch. So if we're breaking things like that down, and then you're actually looking at the true like bar speed and the power production of like 185-pound clean. I don't know what that is exactly, or I can't even ballpark it off the top of my head. But you can get things like that. You can get all of those factors out of your training by doing some really simple medicine ball work, right? Or like you were saying, sprinting comes into play,
Yep.
right? And if you're looking for decel work, there's a ton of different variations you can do that are going to train and teach deceleration and like force absorption,
Yep.
right? So if you start to think about exercises not just as one specific movement or a good thing or a bad thing, but you kind of break down what you're actually looking for your athletes to get better at through that exercise, it will allow you to kind of like, I guess, open your brain up a little bit and say, wow, there is 10 different ways that we can elicit responses that are really close to that.
Yeah.
You know what I mean?
Yeah.
Or the exact same, or even better.
Yep. And I mean, just to bring together that deceleration component, for example, right? Like every single exercise that we choose in here, it can check 15 boxes. Like there's certain exercises we can do that can check a bunch of boxes that we want checked,
Hmm.
right? And if we're in the business of like if we're in this specific exercise we want to work deceleration, why don't we just have them decelerate
Hmm.
at a rapid rate? And to that point, it's like sometimes it's easy to make things super, super complicated and it's harder to simplify it,
Hmm.
right? But at the end of the day, if we want to get them faster, have them run as fast as they can. If we
Right.
want to get them better at decelerating, because that's a property that they need to get better at, we need to have them sprint as hard as they can and then decelerate. If we want to get them better at lateral movement, we got to do that. Force production,
Hmm.
you know, the a very common benchmark or exercise that we utilize for just total force production is the trap bar deadlift,
Hmm.
right? There's a lot of people, that'll say, "Oh, the trap bar deadlift's not a true deadlift," and they're right,
Hmm.
right? But
It's
it's
more of a
not
squat.
but it's not a squat and it's not a true deadlift. It's kind of a
Kind of lives in
hybrid,
the middle.
right? And okay, if we're working absolute force production and wanting like, hey, pull as much weight off the ground as you can. Let's try to peak that as much as we can. That's one of our number one exercises because it checks so many boxes.
Hmm.
Um, but it's like if we're like to the argument for the clean, right? We can box jump a guy, and we're getting the almost the exact same movement out
Hmm.
of them, and we're able to measure. We can approach jump them, and we can have a little bit of a build into it. We can have them do sprints. We can have them do med ball throws, like what you said. We can have them just squat. Right, squatting would increase their ability to power clean.
Hmm.
There's so many different ways that we can increase things, and sometimes it's the hardest to simplify it, especially when we get to a higher training age. We'll have kids that have trained, or guys in general that have trained in here for years, and it's like, okay, they've done everything under the sun pretty much
Yep.
for us.
Progress this,
What
progress that.
what extra progression can we do? Well, they could probably just get better at squatting
Hmm.
and you don't need to reinvent the wheel for it. We're still going to sprint them. We're still going to get a good response out of them. But usually, by the time if someone gets to that point, they're a pretty highly trained individual, and we're not going for, hey, you already deadlift 500 pounds. Let's try to use 600.
Right.
Because we're not training for them to be in a powerlifting
Yeah.
competition.
Does
We're
that
training
move the
them
needle anymore for them?
exactly. And so maybe it's let's create quality movement patterns and let's try to make you faster and make you more resilient.
Yep.
That's pretty much what it ends up being at the end of the day.
And we talk about this a lot when we're not on camera, but some of the stuff we were kind of talking about at the beginning with like the social media presence and things like that are sometimes the want to overcomplicate things when we're looking at exercise selection or training programs are people do that on purpose to make it look good for the camera, right?
Yep.
Like, let's be honest, let's call it like it is.
Yeah.
If we were to show you some of our more basic programs and like videotape them, like hopefully they're being done exceptionally well
Yep.
with high movement quality. Hopefully there's good loads being moved, but it might not like jump off the camera, like,
It's not sexy.
like banded this and chained that, and some of the other stuff that you might see. And so again, like context is key here, and we try to make sure that our athletes understand that, like, hey, we're going to get like savagely good at the basics and then progress you when you're ready to be progressed, right? And we're not trying to have 10 million followers on Instagram. We're trying to deliver a product to the athletes that walk through our door that is going to stand up and that is going to deliver them results that they're looking for, right?
Exactly.
And sometimes when people kind of put the cart before the horse and they want to get into those crazy movement patterns and drills and lifts and stuff like that, it's like, well, you're not there yet,
Yeah.
right? You're not there yet. And I think we could probably rant even harder on people that put that stuff out and kind of the disservice that they're doing, not only to the athletes, but I feel like to the entire community of strength and conditioning coaches who are trying to do it the right way, because it really kind of tilts the scale kind of out of our favor. Because then when people do get a program that is just chock full of basic movements, foundational movements that they need to get better at, they're expecting something like what they see maybe
Yeah.
on Instagram or something
Yep.
like that,
Where the basics and becoming a better athlete is no longer sport specific enough, and they need to have a completely sport specific program. And it becomes, I mean, to the extent like it just becomes so fatty,
hmm
right? Like I've used that word a couple times here. Everything becomes a fad, and they want to make sure that their training looks like this. So then it looks sexy and it's this. But like at the end of the day, when I'm scrolling through Instagram or Twitter or something like that, and I see a baseball player back squatting 600 pounds, I'm like, oh yeah,
hmm
let's go, right? But if I
the
see a
basic.
baseball player doing, you know, the ladder drill, for example, I don't know, we talk a lot of crap about the ladder drill, right? Like disclaimer, there's certain applications for it, but like at the end of the day, the juice isn't worth the squeeze. Um, and in my opinion, right, that's a completely opinionated thing. Um, But I'm like, hey, that dude is back squatting 600 pounds. Oh, and he has a 38-inch vertical. Okay. Holy,
hmm
oh, wow. Okay. That's crazy. But if you really break that down, he did a squat and he did a jump. And that's the most basic movements out there. And he becomes a better athlete overall because of it too.
hmm Yeah. So I guess word to everybody out there is just be careful of the information that you're digesting via socials, right? And you could say that for a lot of different things in this day and age, a lot of different kind of categories or pieces of information that you might see. But find some true quality sources out there and not just your local bro down from the gym, right? Because when again when I'm on like Instagram, there's certain accounts that I am find very trustworthy, and they're people who are like us in the trenches, and they're trying to put good quality info out there. Okay, they're usually not the ones who have 10 million followers and are sponsored by 50 different brands and are pushing this product and pushing that product. Usually it's the coaches who are at universities. Usually it's places like ours who are working in the private sector. A lot of times, well, I know I've stumbled across a few professional strength and conditioning coaches with pro organizations who do a really good job of putting some stuff out, but just always kind of take it with a grain of salt. If it's something that is really kind of blowing your doors off and looks like new and fancy, it might not always be
Yeah,
is kind of like shiny of an object as it looks like on the Instagram,
for
right?
sure. For sure. And we're not saying that all of this stuff is terrible. Like this whole podcast isn't like a complete bashing on how the entire world works and how the social media world works and how these influencers do their jobs and everything like that. This is more, hey, let's realize where we are and what our goals are.
hmm
And if we want to actually achieve our goals, it's not by doing
Circus
XYZ or
training,
ABC, right? And
circus tricks, yeah.
it's about I liked what you said earlier. It's about being savagely good, great at the basics,
Hmm.
and getting there, and then continuing to push the needle, continuing to push the
Yeah.
needle. Find different ways to push the needle after that.
Yep.
Right? Don't try to push. Don't try to find different ways if the way that you're doing is still working.
Hmm.
Right? As soon as that all of what we're doing is we're doing study research on the people that all of that. But we're not planning just easy to get caught up in that stuff. That's what you're constantly, bringing into your. Okay, well, that might be a good place for us to kind of put a cap on. I know we're just trying to go for 30 minutes here. So we have a few other topics that maybe we'll have to save for another day as far as Alex and Bill ranting here. But I think that's a good place for us to stop right now. So just to kind of wrap it all up, just be careful about what you're reading and ingesting out there as far as videos and content. And it's always good to have some people in your corner who understand you as an athlete and understand where you are, and not trying to bring in something that you pulled off the internet that doesn't have context to you as. So just making sure that you take everything into account, and also understanding that there's a ton of gray area kind of in this world. And again, it's a lot of it is kind of specific stuff. So yeah, we'll sign off on that one. All right, another good pod here. We'll see you guys next time. Don't forget, Speed School starts next week. All right, thanks a lot. Goodbye. I wonder if that when your mic dies.